to the Mad Wild West podcast. Kick your boots off and stay a while, because you're about to hear the stories lost in time from the people that lived and made the Wild West mad. This Mad Wild West podcast is brought to you from the 1870s and brought to you by Hostetter Bitters. Hostetter's Stomach Bitters, that is. The finest tonic for nervous people is Hostetter's Stomach Bitters, which ensures perfect digestion and the active performance of their functions by the liver and bowels. As the system acquires tone through its influence of the benign medicine, the nerves grow stronger and more tranquil. Headaches cease, and that nauseous anxiety ceases. It gives way to cheerfulness and establishes a health that is beyond measure. If this is for you and you're looking to be invigorated, try Hostetter Stomach Bitters. Now, just for a little fun, I want to give you listeners a recipe from an 1800s tonic. This one was called Hamel's Wizard Oil. Here's the ingredients. Tincture of camphor, 1 ounce. Aqua ammonia, ½ ounce. Oil of sassafras, 1/4 ounce. Oil of cloves, 1 dram. Chloroform, 2 drams. Turpentine, 1 dram. And alcohol, 3½ ounces. Anything made like that will cure just about any of your problems. Okay, let me take that back. Maybe not cure it, but you'll forget about all your problems. And that's how they made over-the-counter cures back in the Mad Wild West. It's time to take a look at some news from the 1800s in the Mad Wild West. This is from the Tombstone Daily, February 10th, 1886. This one here really caught my eye. Very interesting. It says, among the relics of the last war stored away in the United States Ordnance Museum on 7th Street is a saber, fully 5 feet long, which was found on the battlefield of Manassas. This formidable-looking weapon was evidently made in some village blacksmith shop from the fabled plowshare at the outbreak of the war, and its handle appears to have been carved with a jackknife from a cow's horn. A Virginian who visited the museum last week recognized the saber as one that had been used by a giant Virginian cavalryman in Stuart's command. The cavalryman in question said the Virginian was nearly 7 feet high and broad in proportion. He had that big saber made by a crossroads horseshoer and fought his way through the Yankee lines with it and entered Washington. But the poor fellow, he was shot at Manassas before he could carry out his own rash purposes. Pretty crazy what you find when you start digging through old newspapers. A giant in the Civil War. Here's the headline from the Arizona Sentinel, August 18th, 1883. A stagecoach robbery. Florence, Arizona, August 11th. Last night, the eastbound stage from this place to Globe was attacked by road agents at a point in the canyon 2 or 3 miles above Riverside, on the road to Pioneer. The robbers killed John Colness, Wells Fargo and Company, messenger, at the first fire, wounded the driver, killed one of the lead horses, and wounded his mate. They then compelled Felix LeBlanche of Evans and LeBranche, merchants of Riverside, one of the stage passengers, to open the treasury box, which he did with a hatchet, which the robbers furnished, disclosing a sack with $2,000 in silver and one containing $800 in gold. The former was intended for payment of hands in the mines at the Pioneer, and the other consigned to parties at Globe City. The dead body of the messenger was brought into Florence by buckboard between 12 and 1 o'clock today, and placed in his rooms at the Bostwick Building, where an inquest has begun by the coroner Harry Schultzen. As you all know from this podcast, the roads in the Mad Wild West were very dangerous. It's time now to get on with the main story. Today we're talking about the Salt River Massacre in Arizona, east of Phoenix. The Salt River flows out of the east of Phoenix and actually cuts back through Phoenix. If you've never been, it's a beautiful place. You could currently float down it, whether it's on inner tubes, kayaks, whatever, but beautiful place. And you can even see wild horses. I've seen them myself a couple times along the riverbanks. So gorgeous, and it's hard to believe when you're floating down it that 160, 170 years ago, there was a very real tragedy that happened there. We're picking up the story here. This was written a first-hand account by a lieutenant that was serving in the Cavalry here in Arizona at the time. And we're going to pick it up where it's a time when the Cavalry were roaming in squads throughout the lands of Arizona and New Mexico, and right in the middle of the Indian Wars. So we're going to pick it up right where a band is talking to one of the scouts. Many times these scouts were Native American scouts helping the Cavalry, and that's what it is in this case. So let's pick it up here where the writer, the lieutenant, talks about this sad story. We were becoming rather nervous by this time, as we still had in mind what Nahi had said the previous evening about killing the last of the enemy, or being compelled to fight our own way back. Nahi was thoroughly composed and smiled when some of the party insinuated a doubt about the existence of any large rancheria in the neighborhood. Wait and see was all the reply he would use. By advice of Nahi, Major Brown ordered Lieutenant William Ross to proceed forward on the trail with 12 or 15 of the best shots among the soldiers, and such of the packers as had obtained permission to accompany the command. Nahi led them down a slippery, rocky, dangerous trail in the wall of the gloomy canyon, which in the cold gray light of the slowly creeping dawn and under the gloom of our surroundings made us think of the valley of the shadow of death. "They ought to be very near here," said Major Brown. "Good heavens, what's all that?" It was a noise equal to that of a full battery of 6-pounders going off at once. Brown knew something of the greatest consequence had happened, and he wasn't the man to wait for the arrival of messengers. He ordered me to take command of the first 40 men in advance, without waiting to see whether they were white or red soldiers or packers, and go down the side of the canyon on the run, until I had joined Ross, and taken up the position as close to the enemy as possible for me to get without bringing on a fight. Meantime, he would gather up all the rest of the command and follow me as fast as he could and relieve me. There was no trouble at all getting down into the canyon. The difficulty was to hold on to the trail. Any man lost his footing, he would not have stopped until he struck the current of the Salt River, hundreds of feet below. In spite of everything, we clambered down, and by the great good luck broke no necks. As we turned a sudden angle in the wall, we saw the condition of affairs most completely. The precipice forming that side of the canyon was hundreds of feet high, but at a point some 400 or 500 feet below the crest had fallen back into a shelf upon which was a cave of no great depth. In front of the cave, great blocks of stone furnished a natural rampart, behind which the garrison could bid defiance to the assaults of almost any enemy. In this air, the band of Apaches felt a security such as the eagle or vulture can feel in the seclusion of the ice-covered drizzy pinnacles of the Andes. From the shelf upon which they live, these Indians, who seemed to me to have been the last of the cliff dwellers within our borders, had on several occasions watched the commands of Stanford and Carr struggle to make their way up the streams in the canyon below. The existence of one or perhaps two rancheras somewhere within this gloomy canyon had long been suspected, but never demonstrated until the present moment. When we joined Ross, we heard his story told in few words. He and his small band of 12 had followed Felmer and McIntosh down the face of the cliff until they had reached a small opening space in front of the cave. There they saw within a very few yards of them the party of raiders just returned from the Gila settlements, who had left at pasture the band of 15 ponies which we had seen. These warriors were dancing, either to keep themselves warm or as a portion of some religious ceremony, as it is generally the case with tribes in the Southwest. Close by them crouched a half-dozen squaws, aroused from slumber to prepare food for the hungry braves. The flames of the fire, small as it was, reflected back from the high walls, gave a weird illumination to the features of the circle, and enabled the whites to take better aim upon their unsuspecting victims. Ross and Nahi consulted in whispers, and immediately it was decided that each man should, with the least noise possible, cock his piece and aim at one of the group without reference to what his next-door neighbor might be doing. Had not the Apaches been interested in their own singing, they might have surely heard the low whispers, "Ready, aim, fire," but it would have been too late. The die was cast, and their hour had come. The fearful noise which we had heard, reverberating from peak to peak and from crag to crag, was the volley poured in by Ross and his comrades, which had sent 6 souls to their last account, and surrounded the death knell of a powerful band. The surprise and terror of the Indians were so complete that they thought only of the safety which the interior of the cave offered. And as a consequence, when my party arrived on the scene, although there were a number of arrows thrown at us as we descended the path and rounded the angle, yet no attempt was made at a counter-assault. And before the Apaches could recover from their astonishments, the two parties united, numbering more than 50, near 60 men, had secured position within 30 yards of one flank of the cave, and within 40 yards of the other, and each man posted behind rocks in such a manner that he might just as well be in a rifle pit. My instructions were not to make any fight, but to keep the Apaches occupied, in case they tried to break out of the trap, and to order all men to shelter themselves to the utmost. Major Brown was down in the remainder of the command almost before a shot could be exchanged with the enemy. Although there were 2 more killed either a moment before his arrival or very soon after. One of these was Apima, one of our own allies, who persisted in disregarding orders and exposed himself to the enemy's fire and was shot through the body and died before he ever knew what struck him. The other was one of the Apaches who had sneaked down along our right flank and was making his way out to try to open up communications with another village and get its people to attack us in the rear. He counted without his host and died a victim to his own carelessness. He had climbed to the top of a high rock some distance down the canyon, and there fancied himself safe from our shots, and turned to give a yell of defiance. His figure outlined against the sky was an excellent mark, and there was an excellent shot among us to take full advantage of it. Blacksmith John Cahill, and his rifle in position like a flash, and shot the Indian through the body. At the time of the fight, we did not know that the Indian had been killed, although Cahill insisted that he had shot him as described, and as those nearest him believed. The corpse could not be found in the rocks before we left, and therefore was not counted. But the squaws at San Carlos have long since told me that their relative was killed there, and that his remains were found after we had left the neighborhood. Brown's first work was to see that the whole line was impregnable to assault from the beleaguered garrison of the cave, and then he directed his interpreters to summon all to an unconditional surrender. The only answer was a shriek of hatred and defiance, threats of what we had to expect, yells and at the thought that none of us should ever see the light of day, but should furnish a banquet for the crows and buzzards, and some scattering shots fired in pure bravado. Brown again summoned all to surrender, and when jeers were once more his sole response, he called upon the Apaches to allow their women and children to come out and assured them kind treatment. To this the answer was the same, the jeers and the taunts of the garrison assuring our people that they were in dead earnest in saying that they intended to fight till they died. For some moments the Apaches resorted to old tactics of enticing some of our unweary soldiers to expose themselves above the wall of rocks behind which Major Brown ordered all to crouch. A hat or war bonnet would be set upon the end of a bow, and held in such a way to make believe that there was a warrior behind it, and induce someone proud of his marksmanship to lay for the red man and brother, who would in his turn be laying for the white man in some coign of vintage close to where his squaws was holding the headgear. But such tricks were entirely too transparent to deceive many, and after a short time the Apaches themselves grew tired of them and began trying new methods. They seemed to be abundantly provided with arrows and lances, and of the former made no saving, but would send them flying in the air in hope that upon coming back to earth they might hit those of our regard who were not taking such good care of themselves as were their brothers at the front of the skirmish line. There was a lull of a few minutes. Each side was measuring its own strength and that of its opponent. It was apparent that any attempt to escalate without ladders would result in the loss of more than half our command. The great rock wall in front of the cave was not an inch less than 10 feet height at its lowest point, and smooth as the palm of the hand. It would be madness to attempt to climb it, because the moment the assailants reached the top, the lances of the invested force could push them back to the ground, wounded to death. 3 or 4 of our picket shots were posted in eligible positions overlooking the places where the Apaches had been seen to expose themselves. This in the hope that any reoccurrence of such foolhardiness would afford an opportunity for the sharpshooters to show their skill. Of the main body, one half was in reserve 50 yards behind the skirmish line. To call it such, where the whole business was a skirmish line, with carbines loaded and cocked and a handful of cartridges on the clean rocks in front, and every man on the lookout to prevent the escape of a single warrior, should any be fortunate enough to sneak through the first line. The men on the first lines had order to fire as rapidly as they choose, directing aim against the roof of the cave, with a view to having the bullets glance down among the Apache men who had massed immediately back of the rock rampart. This plan worked admirably, and so far as we could judge, our shots were telling upon the Apaches and irritating them to that degree that they no longer sought shelter, but boldly faced our fire and returned it with energy. The weapons of the men being reloaded by women who shared their dangers, a wail from a squaw and the feeble cry of a little baby, were proof that the missiles of death were not seeking men alone. Brown ordered our fire to cease, and for the last time summoned the Apaches to surrender, or to let their women and children come out unmolested. On their side, the Apaches also ceased all hostile demonstrations, and it seemed to some of us Americans that they must be making ready to yield, and were discussing the matters among themselves. Our Indian guides and interpreters raised a cry, "Look out, there goes the death song. They are going to charge." It was a weird chant, one not at all easy to describe, half wail and half praise, the frenzy of despair and the wild cry for revenge. Now of the squaws kept time with the shuffling feet, and again the deeper growl of the savage bulldogs, who represented manhood in that cave, was flung back from the cold, pitiless brown of the cliffs. "Look out, here they come." Over the rampart, guided by one impulse, moving as if they were all part of one body, jumped and ran 20 warriors, superb-looking fellows, all of them. Each carried upon his back a quiver filled with long reed arrows of the tribe. Each held in his hand a bowie and a rifle, the latter fully cocked. Half of the party stood upon the rampart, which gave them some chance to sight our men behind smaller rocks in the front, and blazed away for all they were worth. They were trying to make a demonstration to engage our attention, while the other party suddenly slipped down and around our right flank, and out through the rocks which had so evidently sheltered the retreat of the one who had so nearly succeeded in getting away earlier in the morning. Their motives were divine, and their move was frustrated. Our men rushed to the attack like fury, each seeming to be anxious to engage the enemy at close quarters. 6 or 7 of the enemy were killed in a space not 20 feet square, and the rest driven back within the cave, more or less wounded. Although there was a fearful din from the yells, groans, wails of the squaws within the fortress, and the re-echoing of volleys from the walls of the canyon, our command behaved admirably and obeyed its orders to the letter. The second line never budged from its place. One of the charging party, seeing that so much attention was converged upon our right, had slipped down unnoticed from the rampart and made his way to the space between our two lines, and had sprung up to the top of a huge boulder, and there begun his war whoop as a token of encouragement to those still behind. I imagine that he was not aware of our second line and thought that once in our rear was safe. He could keep us busy by picking us off at his leisure. His chant was never finished. It was at once his song of glory and his death song. He had broken through our line of fire only to meet a far more cruel death. 20 carbines were gleaming in the sunlight, just flushing the cliffs. 40 eyes were sighted along the barrels. The Apache looked into the eyes of his enemies, and in not one did he see the slightest sign of mercy. He tried to say something. What it was, no one could ever tell. It was in broken Spanish, was all we could make out before the resounding volley had released another soul from its earthly casket, and let the bleeding corpse fall to the ground as limp as a wet moccasin. He was really a handsome warrior, tall, well-proportioned, finely muscled, and with a bold, manly countenance. Shot to death was the verdict of all who paused to look upon him. But that didn't half express the state of the case. I have never seen a man more thoroughly shot into pieces than that one was. Every bullet seemed to have struck, and not less than 8 or 10 had inflicted mortal wounds. The Apaches in the cave, with death now staring them in the face, did not seem to lose their courage, or shall we say their despair. They resumed their chant and sang with vigor and boldness until Brown determined that the battle or siege must end. Our two lines were now massed in one, and every officer and man told to get ready a package of cartridges. And then, as fast as the breech block of the carbine could be opened and lowered, we were to fire into the mouth of the cave, hoping to inflict the greatest damage by glancing bullets, and then charge in by the entrance on our right flank. The lead poured in by the bucketful, but strangely enough, there was a lull for a moment or two without orders. A little Apache boy, not over 4 years old, ran out from within the cave and stood with thumb in mouth, looking in speechless wonder and indignation at the belching barrels. He was not in much danger because all the carbines were aiming upwards at the roof. Nevertheless, a bullet, whether from our line direct or hurled down from the rocky ceiling, struck the youngster on the skull and plowed a path for itself around the back of his neck, leaving a welt as big as one's finger. The youngster was knocked off his feet and added the tribute of his howls to the roars and echoes of the conflict. Nahi sprang like a deer to where the boy lay and grasped him by one arm and ran him behind a stone. Our men spontaneously ceased firing for 1 minute to cheer Nahi and the kid. The fight was then resumed with great vigor. The Apaches did not relax their fire, but from the increasing groans of the women, we knew that our shots were telling either upon the women in the cave or upon their relatives among the men for whom they were sorrowing. It was exactly like fighting with wild animals in a trap. The Apaches had made up their minds to die if relief did not reach them from some other rancheras, supposed to be close by. Ever since early morning, nothing had been seen of Bruins and Thomas, the men of Company G. With a detachment of Pima guides, they had been sent off to follow the trail of the 15 ponies found at day dawn. Brown was under the impression that the riding party belonging to the cave might have split into 2 or 3 parties, and that some of the latter ones might be trapped and ambushed while ascending the mountain. This was before Ross and Nahi and Felmer had discovered the cave and forced the fight. This part of our forces had marched a long distance down the mountain and was returning to rejoin us when the roar of the carbines apprised them that the worst kind of fight was going on, and that their help would be needed badly. They came back on the double, and as soon as they reached the summit of the precipice, were halted to let the men get their breath. It was a most fortunate thing that they did so, and at that particular spot. Burns and several others went to the crest and leaned over to see what all the frightful hubbub was about. They saw the conflict going on beneath them, and in spite of the smoke, could make out the Apaches were nestling up close to the rock rampart, so as to avoid as much as possible the projectiles which were raining down from the roof of their home. It did not take Burns 5 seconds to decide what should be done. He had 2 of his men harnessed with suspenders of their comrades and made them lean well over the precipice. While the harness was used to hold them in place, these men were to fire with their revolvers at the enemy beneath, and for a volley or so they did very effective work. But the Irish blood got the better of their reason, and in their excitement they began to throw their revolvers at the enemy. This kind of ammunition was rather too costly, but it suggested a novel method of annihilating the enemy. Burns orders men to get together and roll several of the huge boulders which covered the surface of the mountain and drop them over the unsuspecting foe. The noise was frightful, the destruction sickening. Our volleys were still directed against the interface of the cave and the roof, and the Apaches seemed to realize that their only safety lay in crouching close to the great stone heap in front. But even this precarious shelter was now taken away. The air was filled with bounding, plunging fragments of stone, breaking into thousands of pieces with other thousands behind, crashing down with the momentum gained in the descent of hundreds of feet. No human voice could be heard in such cyclone of wrath. The volume of dust was so dense that no eye could pierce it, but over on our left, it seemed that for some reason we could still discern several figures guarding that extremity of the enemy's line. The old medicine man, who, decked in all his fancy of his office, with feathers on his head, decorated shirt on back, and all the sacred insignia known to his people, had defied the approach of death, and kept his place, firing coolly at everything that moved on our side that he could see. His rifle reloaded and handed back to his assistants, either squaws or young men. It was impossible to tell which, as only the armed could be noted in the air. Major Brown signaled up to Burns to stop pouring down his boulders, and at the same time our men were directed to cease fire and to make ready a charge. The fire of the Apaches had ceased, and their chants of defiance were hushed. There was a feeling in the command as if we were about to rush through the gates of a cemetery, and that we should find ghastly spectacles within. But at the same time, it might be that the Apaches had retreated to some recesses in the innermost depths of the cavern unknown to us, and to be prepared to assail all who ventured to cross the wall in front. Precisely at noon we advanced, Corporal Halon of Company G, 5th Cavalry, being the first man to surmount the wall. I hope that my readers will be satisfied with the meagerest description of the awful sight that met our eyes. There were men and women dead or writhing in agonies of death, and with them several babies, killed by our glancing bullets, or by the storm of rocks and stones that ascended from above. While one portion of the command worked at extraditing the bodies from beneath the pile of debris, another stood guard with cocked revolvers or carbines, ready to blow the brains out of the Apache who might, in his desperation, attempt to kill one of our people. But his precaution was entirely useless. All idea of resistance had been completely knocked out of the heads of the survivors, of whom, to our astonishment, there were over 30. How any of the garrison had ever escaped such a storm of missiles was at first a mystery to us, as the cave was scarcely a cave at all, but rather a cliff dwelling, and of no extended depth. However, there were many large slabs of flat stone within the enclosure, either left there by nature or carried by squaws to be employed in various domestic purposes. Behind and under many of the squaws had crept, and others had piled upon the dead to screen themselves and their children from the fury of our assault. 35, if I remember aright, were still living, but in the number are included all who were still breathing. Many were already dying, and nearly one half were dead before we started out of that dreadful place. None of the warriors were conscious except one old man who serenely awaited the last summons. He had received 5 or 6 wounds and was practically dead when we sprang over the entrance wall. There was a general sentiment of sorrow for the old medicine man who had stood up so fiercely on the left of the Apache line. We found his still warm corpse, crushed out of all semblance of humanity beneath a huge mass of rock, which had also extinguished at one fell stroke the light of the life of the squaw and the young man who had remained by his side. The amount of plunder and supplies of all kinds was extremely great, and the band inhabiting these cliffs must have lived with some comfort. There was a great amount of food, roasted mescal, seeds of all kinds, jerked mule or pony meat, and all else that the Indians were wont to store for the winter. Bows and arrows in any quantity, lances, war clubs, guns of various kinds, with ammunition fixed and loose, a perfect stronghold well supplied. So much of the mescal and other food as our scouts wished to pack off on their own backs was allowed them, and everything else was given to flames. No attempt was made to bury the dead, who, with the exception of our own Pimas, were left where they fell. There's the first-hand account of the Salt River Massacre in the Mad Wild West. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode and the crazy stories. And until the next episode, keep your horses tied up. Thanks for listening. The Mad Wild West Podcast. These are the true stories that made it wild.